Would a loving God allow suffering? There are two possibilities I'll cover in this video. Yes, there is a loving God that allows suffering, and no, there's no God because suffering exists. I'll go through the first one since that's my position, and then for those who think God doesn't exist because of the presence of suffering, I'll have some questions for you. So, I believe that a loving God exists despite all the suffering in this world. In Genesis 3, when people sinned, that caused God to punish them. But before that, everything was good, like in Genesis 1 and 2. Suffering exists only because of us humans, not because of God. In fact, God allowed us to disobey Him, but He still carries out the punishment. There are consequences for your actions. That is because He's a just God. So right now we face the consequences of suffering because of our sin. How is this God loving then? Well, in the first place, He gave us the free will to obey or disobey Him instead of forcing us to obey Him. This is very clear when others go against God's instructions, rebelling against Him despite knowing the instructions. So God is showing love by allowing us to decide for ourselves. Next, God is loving because He didn't end human existence there and then. He is almighty, He could have wiped us out of existence for rebelling against Him. So the fact that we still exist all the more shows that God loves us enough to forgive us. So your expectation is that we live in a world with no suffering if God loves us. But your very existence right now all the more shows that God loves you. And at the same time, think about why God gives punishment and consequences. It's because God loves us. That's why we receive punishment. If I see my son getting beaten up by someone, and then I don't do it or try to carry out some punishment for that someone, then I don't love my son. That's just a form of negligence. Or at the same time, if my son does something to rebel against me, and I don't carry out any punishment, that's not love, that's negligence. So there are consequences for all these things, which is why God punishes us. Now I've covered why suffering and a loving God can exist together. Now I wish to ask those who believe that suffering proves that God doesn't exist. Here are some questions you will have to answer, okay? And at the end of the video, I hope you realize that you would have more things to explain. Firstly, if there's no God, then who caused the suffering? If you say there's humans that cause the suffering, then we both agree with that. Because I also believe that humans cause the suffering, not God. Then my next question to you would be that, how does it look like if there's no suffering on this earth? Is it no one dies? But if everyone is immortal, then the world would face overpopulation, and that can't be good. Some people also hate the idea that animals and plants have to suffer because of what humans have done. So if there's no suffering, perhaps the immortality also extends to these animals and plants. But if they all don't die, then what do us humans eat? The more important question amidst all these technicalities is, how would you remove the thing that caused suffering? You might think that it's us humans that cause the suffering. So it seems to me that if the world has no evil or suffering, humans have to be wiped out of existence. So how do you deal with that? I still have more questions. How do you know that suffering exists in the first place? A very simple answer would be that suffering is caused by evil. But how would you know that evil exists if you're an atheist? Atheism is about how we are matter and energy. Some atheists believe that morality is subjective, but if suffering is objectively bad, then wouldn't that suggest a moral standard beyond human opinion? So instead of looking at a dying baby and saying, wow, that is indeed evil, you should instead say, oh, a dying baby? That's just how life is. That's just matter and energy. If suffering exists, that means evil or some kind of moral judgment exists. If that's the case, then wouldn't you say that there's someone outside of mankind to help you see something as evil? Like your conscience? If that's the case, could you still stand on the idea that no God exists but suffering exists? You see, once you acknowledge that suffering exists, you have already trapped yourself by presuming that there's such thing as moral absolutes. So you can't hold on to atheism in that case anymore. And you can try to argue a third possibility, which is that a God exists, suffering exists, and hence the God is unloving. But if God isn't loving, He would have wiped us out of existence for rebelling against Him in the first place. So it's either that or God would have forced us all to love Him and not allow us the free will to go against Him by sinning. But again, it's evident that we can sin. So when you first see this question, it might seem tough to argue that a loving God exists despite all the suffering. In fact, a loving God would then allow suffering. However, if you call some situation on this earth as suffering, this all the more proves that a loving God exists. After a bit of digging, we can then realize how much harder it is to argue for the other cases. If suffering reminds us of the brokenness of this world, then it also points us to our need for God's grace. So let us seek Him and trust in His plan. Thank you all for watching this video. This is a topic that I find it very interesting to talk about. Do you agree with what I've said? Do you have any doubts to clarify or objections to my arguments? Feel free to comment down below so that we can continue this discussion. For the rest of us who have seen the suffering on this earth, let us persevere in this earthly life as we are on the go for Jesus.